The last light of late autumn stretched thin across the northern Wyoming plains as the wind picked up, carrying a sharp cold that warned of a storm rolling in from the hills. The grass bent low in long, steady rows, and dust drifted across the yard, catching on the fence rails. Abel Harkin stepped out of the barn with a coil of rope in one hand and a hammer in the other, his shoulders tight from the long day, his breath showing in small white bursts as he paused to stretch his back. He had been fixing the stall hinges since late afternoon, pushing himself to finish before night fully settled, because routine mattered here. Routine kept the small ranch steady. Routine kept him focused. Routine kept him from thinking too long about the empty place at the table where Lila Harkin used to sit. He was 35, tall, broad through the chest, a quiet man shaped by work and loss. 2 years had passed since he buried his wife behind the cottonwoods, and in that time he had raised his daughter J.C. Harkin alone with a strict order that held their world together. Chop wood at first light, feed the livestock, patch whatever needed patching, cook simple meals, keep J.C. safe, keep the ranch from falling apart, keep himself from collapsing under the weight of grief that still came at him in quiet hours. He moved toward the barn doors to close them before the storm hit. He reached for the sliding latch, but movement near the haystack caught his eye. Too still for an animal and too quiet for anyone who meant well. He froze, every sense tightening the way it had ever since he became a man who lived alone with a child. His hand lowered toward the handle of his belt knife, not fast but prepared, while he narrowed his eyes into the dim corner. Someone sat against the barn wall, knees close to the chest, head lowered, long dark hair hanging over the face. At first he thought it might be someone drunk or half-conscious from cold, but then he saw the shape straighten slightly. A woman. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. Sweat clung to her collarbone despite the cold. Dirt was smeared along her arms. Her torn deerskin dress stuck to her skin, ripped across the chest where beadwork had once held it together. The split seams exposed a deep cleavage, shaped not by choice, but by rough travel and damage. Her curves were noticeable even in her weakened state, her body marked by long hours on foot and fear that had not lifted in days. Her legs trembled uncontrollably. Her fingers clutched a small satchel like it was the last thing tying her to life. She raised her head a little, and he saw her eyes, wide, alert, desperate, scanning him like she was trying to judge if he was safe or another threat. She tried to speak but had to swallow first. "Please," she whispered, voice thin and dry. "One night, I no more walking." Her English was accented but clear. Her throat worked as she fought for breath. Abel didn't move for several seconds. He studied her carefully, assessing danger the way a man alone must. She wasn't armed. She was barely upright. Her fear wasn't the fear of a predator caught. It was the fear of prey with nowhere left to run. He recognized it too well. He had seen that same look on families who'd lost their homes to raids, on soldiers who'd survived ambushes, on men who realized their lives had turned without warning. Still, he hesitated. Taking strangers in could end badly. J.C. was inside. Everything in him wanted to keep distance. But the woman lifted a shaking hand toward him, not begging, not reaching, just showing she held nothing to harm him. And something inside him softened a little. Before he could answer, a small voice carried from the house. "Papa!" J.C. Harkin stood framed by the doorway, a thin blanket over her shoulders, bare feet tucked against the warm floor. She was 6 years old, small, dark-haired, with wide, observant eyes that caught every detail. She saw the woman in the barn, but she didn't run or cry. She simply watched, her young face showing confusion and worry. "It's all right," Abel said. He kept his tone even. JC trusted even tones. The girl hesitated, then stepped back into the house, leaving the door cracked open. Abel turned back to the woman. "Can you stand?" She tried, pushing herself up with one hand braced against the barn wall, but her legs buckled right away. Her breath hitched in frustration and fear. She tried again, her jaw tightening, but her knees gave out harder this time. Abel stepped forward on instinct, catching her around the waist before she hit the ground. Her body sagged into him, her chest brushing his shirt, her head leaning against his shoulder. He could feel the tremor running through her, not from cold, but from exhaustion so deep it seemed rooted in her bones. She struggled to steady herself, embarrassed, her fingers gripping his arm hard. He tightened his hold without thinking, lifting her enough to take her weight. "I can walk," she whispered, but her voice shook. "We'll go slow," he said. He guided her toward the cabin, step by step, her hand clutching his sleeve as if she feared letting go. Her breathing stayed uneven. Her dress shifted with each movement, the torn fabric slipping against her curves, revealing more of her chest than she seemed aware of. She kept pulling the torn edges together with trembling fingers, glancing at him to see if he was judging her. He wasn't. He knew desperation when he saw it. Whatever had torn her dress hadn't been vanity. Inside, the warm glow from the fire lit the room in soft orange. JC Harkin sat at the table, her feet dangling above the floor, watching with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Abel Harkin eased the woman into a chair. She exhaled sharply, as if letting go of weight she had carried for too long. He brought her a blanket. Her hand shook while she pulled it around her shoulders, and he noticed faint scratches along her legs and arms, the kind travelers get when running through brush without stopping. She finally spoke again. "My name Nita." Her voice steadied a little. "I come far." Abel nodded. "This is my daughter, JC," he said. JC gave a small wave with 2 fingers. Nita forced a tiny smile. Abel poured water into a tin cup and held it out. He saw her hesitation, fear of being tricked, poisoned, hurt, but after a second she took it with both hands and drank slowly. Each swallow looked painful. When she finished, she lowered the cup and drew a shaky breath, her eyes lifting to his with something like relief, or trust, or both. As she settled, Abel studied her more closely. Her hair was tangled and partly braided, strands stuck to her face with dried sweat. Her dress hung loose where the seams had given out. Her satchel looked nearly empty. Everything about her told a story of days spent running from something worse than hunger. JC tilted her head. "Will she stay?" she asked gently. Nita looked down, unsure if she should answer. Abel cleared his throat. "She'll stay tonight. Storm's coming." Nita's shoulders loosened. A small breath escaped her. Part exhaustion, part gratitude, part something else he couldn't name. She looked at the cabin again, taking in every detail. The stacked firewood by the hearth, the simple furniture, the extra chair pushed against the wall, the family drawings JC had taped near the window. Her eyes lingered on those drawings the longest. For a second, she looked like someone remembering what home once felt like. JC slid off her chair and stepped closer. "You look tired," she said softly. Nita nodded. "Very tired." "You can have my blanket," JC added, holding it out. Nita took it slowly, her eyes warming. "Thank you." Abel watched the exchange, something tightening in his chest, something protective, something wary, something he hadn't felt in a long while. Allowing this woman inside meant allowing risk. It meant opening the door to something he couldn't easily control. But when Nita lifted her gaze again, he saw a woman who had run until she could barely breathe, who had been hunted or abandoned or both, who had nowhere left to go, and he made his decision. "Eat first," he said quietly. "Then you rest." Nita nodded once, and for the first time since she had appeared in the barn shadows, her eyes stopped darting around the room. They settled. Just a little. Outside, the storm began hitting the roof in steady, cold sheets. Inside, the three of them sat together. Not speaking much, but sharing something solid. Warmth, safety, and a moment where none of them felt alone. And as Abel watched the woman's trembling ease slowly, he understood something important. She hadn't stumbled onto his land by chance. Whatever she had been running from would not stay far behind. And this night, which he expected to be simple, had just changed the course of their lives. Night settled heavy around the cabin, while the storm pushed against the walls in long, steady gusts. The wind slipping through cracks in the wood and carrying the smell of wet earth. Inside, the fire snapped and popped, throwing a steady glow across Nita's face as she finished the small bowl of stew Abel had given her. Her hands still shook a little, but color had returned to her cheeks, and the wild panic in her eyes had softened into exhaustion. JC sat nearby on her small stool, holding her blanket and watching Nita with a mix of curiosity and quiet concern. Abel had not sat down. He never fully relaxed around strangers. And tonight, the old instinct stayed sharp. He stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes moving between Nita and the window where the storm flashed in short bursts of white. He wasn't suspicious of her the way a frightened man might be. His caution came from experience. People didn't collapse in barns for no reason. People didn't show up alone in late autumn with nothing but a torn dress and a satchel, unless something had gone wrong. Badly wrong. Nita noticed he was watching her and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, pulling the torn edges of her dress together. "I not mean trouble," she said gently, her voice careful, as if she worried a wrong tone would get her thrown out into the storm. "I only run. I try to stay alive." Abel didn't answer immediately. He studied her face. The fatigue settled deep under her eyes, the tension still sitting in her shoulders, the way she kept her satchel close to her side. He finally asked the question anyone would ask, but he asked it in a calm, steady tone. "Who were you running from?" Nita lowered her eyes. For a moment, she didn't speak at all. Her fingers tightened around the rim of the bowl. The fire cracked loudly, and she jumped slightly, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to show how raw her nerves were. JC leaned forward. "You don't have to be scared," she said, her small voice soft but sure. "Papa doesn't hurt people." Nita's gaze flicked to the little girl with something that looked painfully close to gratitude, and then she looked back at Abel. "My husband died," she said. "His brother blamed me. He said I kill him. My people, they believe him." Her voice wavered but didn't break. "I did not kill, but I run because they say they take me back." Town men hurt story too. They come for reward, so I run for both. She touched her chest lightly over her heart. "I only want to live." That answered the first question Abel had been holding back. Why she was alone. Now he understood. She was being hunted by her own people and by white men looking to profit from a rumor. Not a good mix, not for her, not for him, not for JC. He didn't show the worry on his face, but he felt it settle in his stomach. Bringing her inside had already changed things. He couldn't turn her back out, but keeping her meant danger could come to his doorstep. He weighed that silently, jaw tightening. "You hurt anywhere besides the scratches?" he asked, his tone even. She shook her head. Only tired. Legs no strength left. Her legs were still trembling under the blanket, and she had not stood straight on her own since he'd carried her inside. He knew enough about exhaustion to recognize when a person had pushed beyond what their body could manage. She would not make it another mile tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. JC swung her feet gently, watching both adults. "Can she sleep in Mama's room?" she asked suddenly, her voice cautious, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say it. Abel's breath caught slightly. He hadn't stepped into that room in months. He used it for storage now. Linens, old quilts, boxes of things he hadn't had the strength to sort through. He hesitated, then answered softly, "No, honey. Not that room." JC nodded and looked down, accepting it without argument. Nita watched the exchange, confusion crossing her face. "I sleep on floor," she said quickly. "I do not need room. I not take space." Abel shook his head. "Floor gets cold. You can take the spare bed." He motioned toward the small room near the back of the cabin, the one he'd built for hired hands back when they still came around. No one had slept there since before Lila Harkin died. "It's warm enough." Nita seemed surprised, then quietly relieved. She nodded once. "Thank you." Abel wasn't done sorting the details. He asked the things any cautious man needed to know. "Anyone see you come this way? Anyone close behind you?" Nita shook her head. "Last men I see were yesterday afternoon. 2 white men on horses. I hide in rocks until they pass." She hesitated, then added, "They wear coats with red patch on sleeve. Sheriff, maybe." She looked up at him with worry. "I do not know if they come back." That was something important. Abel filed it away. 2 mounted riders with marked coats meant organized searchers, not drunks chasing shadows. It meant someone in town had reason to believe the rumor, or wanted a profit from it. It meant they might not quit until they found her. He didn't show fear, but he did feel the weight of responsibility settle heavier across his chest. He glanced at JC, small, trusting, unaware of the danger adults brought into each other's lives. And he made a quiet decision he didn't say out loud. He would not let strangers drag fear into this house. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Nita's breathing slowed. JC rested her head on her arms at the table. The storm rattled the window shutters again. Finally, Abel stepped forward. "Finish the stew. Then I'll help you to the spare room." Nita nodded, eating carefully in small bites. When she set the bowl down, Abel moved to her side, offering his arm without touching her first. She hesitated, then grasped it, using him for balance. Her legs threatened to give way again, her weight leaning into him, her breath catching as she steadied herself. He guided her through the narrow hallway, JC following behind with a blanket dragging lightly across the floor. The spare room was simple: 1 bed, 1 table, 1 small window. But the moment Nita saw it, her tense shoulders eased, as if the sight of a real bed meant safety she hadn't felt in weeks. She sank onto the mattress, exhaling hard, her body slumping under the weight of exhaustion. JC Harkin stepped forward, placing her own small blanket beside Nita on the bed. "You can use it if you get cold," she whispered. Nita's eyes warmed. "You very kind," she said softly. JC nodded with a shy little smile and stepped back to Abel's side. Abel Harkin watched Nita carefully. She wasn't pretending weakness. She wasn't forcing trust. She was simply done. Physically, mentally, and emotionally done. And he could see it clearly in the way her hands folded together, as if holding on to something only she understood. "You're safe tonight," he said, keeping his tone steady. Nita looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to believe it. "I hope," she whispered. Abel nodded and stepped out, pulling JC gently with him. He left the door open just enough so she could feel the firelight reach inside. When they returned to the main room, JC tugged at his sleeve. "Papa?" she said quietly. "Is she going to stay tomorrow too?" Abel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the oil lamp and adjusted the flame. Only after a long pause did he speak. "We'll see," he said. But in his chest, something had already settled. This wasn't a one-night problem. This woman wasn't just passing through. Her fear, her wounds, and her shaking legs told a story that wouldn't end by morning. He sat down at the table, rubbing a hand over his jaw, thinking through every choice he had made tonight, and every choice he would have to make tomorrow. Outside, the storm pushed harder. Inside, 3 lives had begun to shift in ways none of them had planned, and Abel knew, deep down, that the questions anyone might ask: who was chasing her? How dangerous was this? Could he protect JC if trouble followed her tracks? And what kind of woman kept running even when her whole body wanted to collapse? Those questions wouldn't stay unanswered for long. Tomorrow would force them all into the open. Dawn came slow over the plains, a dull gray light pushing through the storm clouds that had battered the cabin all night. The wind had died, but the cold settled deeper, pressing against the windows and leaving a thin layer of frost along the glass. Abel Harkin rose before sunrise, as he always did, pulling on his boots quietly so JC could sleep a little longer. His movements were steady but slower than usual. His mind was still turning over everything Nita had revealed the night before. A hunted woman, a false accusation, men with marked coats, rumors spreading between towns. None of it sat easy with him. He stepped into the hallway and paused outside the spare room. The door stood partway open, exactly how he'd left it. Inside, Nita lay curled under JC's small blanket, the rest of the bedding pulled up to her chin. She didn't look peaceful. Her eyebrows drew together, her fingers clenched the blanket, and her breaths came deep and uneven. But she was finally asleep. Her hair fell across her cheek, tangled but no longer plastered with sweat. The dirt on her skin looked lighter now that exhaustion had eased its grip. He noticed how she kept one hand resting on her satchel, even in sleep. That told him something important. Whatever was in there mattered, and he needed to find out what. Not by force, not by prying, but because danger didn't come this far north by accident. If men were searching for her, the reason would matter, especially with JC in the house. He stepped away and headed outside. The cold bit sharply at his face as he crossed the yard. The storm had left the ground slick with mud and scattered bits of broken branches. The horses were restless, shifting in the corral, snorting clouds of white breath. He reached for the gate, calming them with a low murmur. Routine steadied him. Feed the horses, break the ice on the trough, check the fence line. But even while he worked, his thoughts kept circling back. Why had her tribe believed she killed her husband? Why had the townsfolk chased her? Why would 2 armed riders with sheriff-like markings come this far out? There were gaps in her story. Understandable gaps. Fear could make someone leave out the worst details. But gaps all the same. And anyone listening to their story would ask the same things he was asking now. Was Nita truly innocent? Did someone frame her? What did she carry in that satchel that mattered enough to run with until her legs gave out? He would need answers, but he had to wait until her body was strong enough to speak them. When he returned to the cabin, JC was awake, sitting on her knees by the fire and braiding her hair. She looked up. "Papa, is she still sleeping?" Abel nodded. "She needs it." JC hesitated, then asked something she'd clearly been thinking since last night. "Will the men come here?" JC Harkin's small voice trembled as she spoke. Abel Harkin crouched beside her and brushed a few strands of hair from her face. "Not if I can help it," he said. "But if they do—" He met her eyes. "Then they'll talk to me, not you, understand?" She nodded, trusting him fully, the way only a child could. Nita woke a short while later. When she stepped into the main room, she moved slowly, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. Her legs still trembled, but she was upright, her breathing smoother than the night before. She looked different in the morning light, still tired, still worn down, but clearer somehow, like her mind had caught up with her body. She pulled the blanket tighter around her torn dress, trying to hide the exposed skin. Her cleavage still showed through the damaged seams, but she held the fabric with more awareness now. She stood tall, despite her fear. "Good morning," JC said, smiling. Nita managed a small smile back. "Good morning, little one." Abel set a bowl of warm oats on the table. "Sit. Eat something." She obeyed without argument, taking small, careful bites. But she kept watching him, gauging him, maybe waiting to see if he regretted letting her stay. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant. "You know, ask questions today." Abel leaned against the counter. "You need strength first." Nita looked down at her bowl, her fingers tightening around the wooden spoon. "Many ask questions," she said quietly. "They not believe answers." "What about the men chasing you?" he asked, his tone even. "You think they'll come back this way?" She hesitated long enough that he knew the truth before she said it. "Yes." JC looked at her father, concern rising in her small face. Nita continued, choosing her words carefully. "The brother of my husband, he want proof I guilty. He say he see me kill, but he lie. He want land my husband leave. If I die, it become his." Her breath shook, but she didn't break. "Town men hear story. They want reward money. Sheriff, I think he believe my husband's brother. Maybe Sheriff think he do right." That filled in what Abel needed to know. It explained why both her people and the townsmen had turned against her. Land, lies, and a rumor that spread too far. Abel folded his arms, absorbing every piece. "And what's in that satchel?" Nita froze. Her eyes snapped toward her side where the small bag sat near her feet. She pulled it closer, protectively. "It is mine," she said, fear tightening her voice. "Only mine. Nothing dangerous." He watched her carefully. It wasn't anger. She wasn't hiding something harmful. It was fear, defensive fear, the kind born from losing everything else. He didn't press her. Not yet. "All right," he said. "I won't touch it." Her shoulders eased slightly. JC climbed onto the bench beside her. "Are you staying today?" she asked with childish honesty. Nita hesitated, looking to Abel as if asking permission without words. "I stay until my leg's strong," she said softly. "Then I leave. I did not bring danger to your home." Abel shook his head. "Danger's already out there, whether you rest or walk, and you won't make it a mile in your condition." She opened her mouth to protest, but he continued, his voice quiet and firm. "You stay until I say otherwise, and when men come, they'll talk to me." Her breath caught. Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but disbelief. She didn't understand why he would risk that. Not yet. She reached for her bowl again, her hand brushing his wrist briefly. The contact was small, but full of weight. Trust was coming, slow and cautious. A moment later, the distant sound of hooves echoed faintly across the cold air. Abel stiffened. Nita froze where she sat. JC turned toward the window with wide eyes. Abel moved toward his rifle, not with panic but purpose, lifting it from the hooks by the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Nita swallowed hard. "Is them?" Abel stared toward the yard, his jaw tightening. "We'll find out." He stepped out onto the porch, the cold morning wind pushing against him, the land stretching quiet and long in every direction. One rider, maybe two, coming up the far ridge. The night's fears had only just begun to take shape, and the day had only just begun. Abel Harkin stood on the porch with a rifle resting loosely in his hand, his eyes narrowing at the distant ridge where two riders emerged slowly through the thin morning fog. The cold air carried the sound of hooves clearly now, steady and controlled. Not rushed, not panicked. Men who moved with purpose, men who knew how to track, men who didn't come this far off the main trail by accident. Inside the cabin, Nita stood frozen near the window, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, her face pale beneath the bronze tone of her skin. JC Harkin clung to her hand without fear, but with the instinctive worry of a child who understood danger wasn't a storybook thing. Abel didn't lift the rifle to aim. Not yet. A drawn weapon spoke louder than words, and he needed to see who they were first. When the riders came close enough, he recognized the coats. Dark wool with stitched red patches near the shoulder. Not sheriff's men, but deputy scouts from the town south of the ridge. Men who took work wherever it paid better. Men who looked for trouble because trouble paid. The lead rider, a thin man with a blonde mustache and hard eyes, slowed his horse near the corral. He tipped his hat in a stiff greeting. "Morning, Harkin," he called. Abel kept his voice even. "You're far off your usual path." "Storm blew us off the trail," the man replied. "Looking for a woman passed through 2 nights back." His eyes drifted past Abel towards the house. Apache woman. Runs fast, small, curvy. Wears a torn deerskin dress. Inside the cabin, Nita's breath hitched. The sound faint but sharp enough for JC to squeeze her hand tighter. Abel didn't turn. "Haven't seen anyone." The second rider, a broader man with a crooked nose, leaned in his saddle. "Tracks led near your fence line." "Storm erased any tracks last night," Abel replied calmly. "You're wasting daylight." The blond man narrowed his eyes. "Someone said you got a spare room out back. That true?" Abel's grip tightened around the rifle stock. Not enough to show aggression, but enough to feel the weight of it. "This is my land, my rooms, my say." The man studied him, gauging whether Abel was bluffing. He wasn't. "We're just following a lead," the crooked-nosed rider said, trying to sound polite, but landing on irritation. "Sheriff says she's wanted." "What she wanted for?" Abel asked, knowing full well the answer mattered. "Killing her husband," the blond man replied. "Her own people say it. Sheriff believes it." He shrugged as if the explanation was enough. "We bring her in. We get paid. Law stays quiet. Easy." Inside, Nita lowered her head, shame and injustice twisting deep inside her. JC looked between her and the door, uncertain. Abel's jaw tightened. "You boys got proof?" The blond man smirked. "Sheriff says her husband's brother saw it." That answered what any listener would wonder: how the law got involved. The sheriff had taken the brother's word without a second thought. A lie turned into a warrant. "And you trust that?" Abel asked. "We trust whoever signs the coin," the crooked-nosed man said bluntly. The wind shifted, carrying the cold deeper across the yard. Abel stepped forward half an inch, not threatening, just firm. No one passed through here. Storm wiped everything clean. You got no reason to search my property. The blond man looked toward the cabin again. Mind if we check? Yes, Abel answered without hesitation. Both riders stiffened slightly. The refusal surprised them, or irritated them, but neither man reached for his weapon. They knew Abel Harkin's reputation. Quiet, solitary, not a man who bluffed or backed down. A rancher who had fought off rustlers more than once. A widower who didn't tolerate strangers pressing into his life. After a tense pause, the blond rider, Boone Taggart, clicked his tongue and pulled at his reins. If she shows, Harkin, you better let us know. Sheriff won't take kindly to folks hiding a fugitive. Abel didn't blink. If I see anyone around here, I'll handle it. The man with the crooked nose, Dusty Maris, spat to the side. Storm's clearing. Tracks will show soon enough. The two riders turned their horses and headed back toward the ridge, muttering low to each other. Abel watched them disappear over the rise before lowering the rifle. The morning wind carried silence again, but the kind that didn't feel safe. Inside, Nita stepped back from the window, her breath unsteady, her hands shaking worse now than the night before. When Abel Harkin stepped through the door, she looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. You tell them nothing, she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Abel closed the door behind him. I told them the storm erased tracks, and it did. She swallowed hard. They come back. Maybe, he admitted. J.C. Harkin tugged on her father's sleeve. Papa, what if they find her? Abel crouched to her level. I won't let them take her. Those words hung heavy, bigger than anything he'd said since Nita arrived. Nita sank into the nearest chair, covering her mouth with her hand. I don't want danger here, she whispered. You have child. You have home. I take trouble with me. Your trouble's already on the land, Abel replied. Running now won't stop them. They'd track you easy in daylight. Nita closed her eyes, shame and fear washing through her like a weight she couldn't lift. My husband's brother. He want land. He lie. He say he see me kill. But law believe him. Town believe him. She shook her head. I no have voice. J.C. walked to her and gently placed a hand on her arm. You have one now. Nita looked at the little girl, emotion tightening her throat. Her hands slowly lowered, no longer gripping the satchel, no longer shielding herself. Abel pulled the chair out and sat across from her. You need to tell me everything, he said. Not because I doubt you, because I need to know what's coming. She nodded slowly. I tell truth. Nita drew a breath. My husband died in fight with white traders. Not my hand. His brother want land. Say I cause fight. Say I make husband angry. Say I push him into danger. He go to sheriff. He go to tribe elders. He say I evil woman. They listen to him. Tears didn't fall, but her voice cracked from trying to hold them back. I run because if I stay, they take me back. If I go to sheriff, he send me to cells. Both ways I die. Abel absorbed every word. You didn't kill him. She shook her head violently. No. I love him. Even when marriage not easy. She looked down, pain flickering across her face. Abel leaned forward slightly. Then you stay until your strength returns. We'll figure it out. Nita looked up slowly. Why you help me? Abel held her gaze, his voice low. Because I know what it's like losing someone, and I know what it's like to have no one believe you. Something shifted in her expression, fear loosening, trust beginning to grow in a way she tried to fight. She nodded once, eyes softening. Then another heavy question surfaced, one both characters and listeners would wonder. She voiced it quietly. What if they come back with more men? Abel looked toward the door, then back at her. Then they'll find I'm not alone this time. Her breath caught. Heat rose through her chest as the meaning set in. Not alone. Not her. Him. JC. A house with more warmth than she expected to find again. Nita swallowed hard, her voice almost too soft to hear. I not know how to stay safe, but I try. Abel nodded. And I'll handle the rest. Rain began again outside, tapping lightly against the shutters. But the storm inside the cabin had shifted into something steadier, fear still present, but carried together now. And for the first time since Nita fled her old life, she didn't feel like prey. She felt protected. The rain weakened by mid-afternoon, leaving a soft mist across the yard and a steady drip from the roof. The air held a damp cold that seeped through the boards, but inside the cabin the fire stayed warm, filling the room with an orange light that pushed back the gray outside. Abel Harkin had moved into a quiet routine, checking the windows, watching the distant ridge, making sure no riders circled back. Every few minutes he looked toward the horizon with that careful, calculating gaze of a man who had learned to expect the worst long before he dared hope for the best. Nita sat at the table with JC Harkin, helping the little girl braid her hair. Her movements were slow, almost delicate, as if each gesture cost strength she didn't quite have, but refused to show. Her legs still trembled sometimes, but she sat straighter than the night before. Her breathing no longer stuttered, and color had returned to her skin. The torn deerskin dress still hung open along the chest, exposing the deep cleavage where the fabric had ripped during her escape. She tried to keep the blanket pulled over it, but each time she moved, part of it slipped, and she had to readjust, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. JC didn't seem to notice. Abel did, but he didn't stare or comment, which only deepened Nita's fragile trust in him. JC's voice broke the quiet. Will the bad men come back today? Nita paused mid-braid, her fingers tightening around JC's hair. She looked toward Abel instinctively. He turned from the window, his voice steady. They got what they came for. Nothing. They'll spread out. Maybe check the river trail or the old cattle road before they ride back to town. JC nodded, but her eyes stayed worried. So they still might come? Abel exhaled slowly. If they do, they'll find me waiting. Listeners might wonder how much danger the ranch truly faced, and whether the men would act on suspicion alone. This moment showed Abel's quiet readiness, the calm preparation of a man who had lived long with danger, and the reality that Clyde Barker's authority stretched further than the truth ever did. JC turned back around as Nita finished the braid and tied it with a bit of yarn. Thank you, the girl grinned. You're welcome. Nita smiled faintly, though her hands trembled again. Abel noticed. You eaten enough? She hesitated. Yes, maybe. JC giggled. That means she's still hungry, Papa. Nita blushed. Abel reached for the stew pot. Eat more, he said simply. You won't get your strength back on half a bowl. She didn't argue this time. She took the food quietly, but her eyes softened, not just in gratitude, but something deeper. She wasn't used to someone noticing the small things. She wasn't used to being looked after without suspicion or anger. She ate slowly. When she finished, she set the bowl down and took a careful breath. I tell you something, she said softly. Something I not say before. You need to know. Abel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. JC scooted closer, listening. Nita looked down at her hands. My husband. He was not bad man. He work horses. He love his land. But he drink too much, sometimes. When he drink, he not speak soft. He get angry. She swallowed. But he never hit. He never hurt me. Only words. She tapped her chest. Words can hurt too. It was a quiet confession, one that gave her pain a face, and her marriage a truth. Flawed, strained, but not cruel. Nita continued. His brother hate that I come from different people. He say I not belong. After my husband die in fight, his brother see chance. He go to sheriff. He say I kill for land. Her breath shook. The elders of my people hear rumor. Some believe, some not. But brother speak loud. He say he see me do it. Lying. Her voice cracked, just slightly. He say if I die, land become his. JC frowned, confused. But why would he lie? Nita touched the girl's cheek gently. Some men want things they never earn. Abel studied her face. Did anyone try to defend you? Nita nodded slowly. One woman, old healer. She say I innocent. She say brother lie. She tell me run. She say if I stay, he make proof against me. She give me this. Nita touched the satchel at her side. It was my husband's. Paper inside. She say keep safe. Abel's eyes hardened. Papers? She nodded. Paper with his name. Paper with line mark of land. She say show he give land to me before he die. If brother find paper, he destroy it. That revealed the truth behind the satchel, the proof that her husband had left her the land, and the reason Silas Gant was desperate to hunt her down. So you're running with the only proof he doesn't inherit the land, Abel said. Yes. JC blinked. So that's why they want to catch you? Yes, Nita said, her voice tight. If they take me, paper go away. Truth go away. Abel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Let me see it. She hesitated, fear rising again. But she reached into the satchel anyway and carefully unfolded the papers. She handed them to him with trembling hands. He spread them on the table, examining the rough signatures, the marks, the tribal symbols, and the English writing confirming land rights. The documents looked legitimate. This is real, he said firmly. Nita exhaled in shaky relief. JC leaned over the papers. So if they find you, they'll take these from you. Nita nodded. And say I forged them. Abel folded the papers back into the satchel and pushed it toward her. You keep it close. A quick knock startled all three of them. JC jumped. Nita grabbed the satchel, clutching it to her chest. Abel moved instantly, his hand steady, his jaw set, as the sound echoed again through the quiet cabin. Abel Harkin stepped in front of both of them, his rifle already in his hand before the second knock came. But the voice that followed wasn't the rider's from earlier. Abel, you home? It was Jed Flint, a neighboring homesteader who came by once every few weeks to trade flour or borrow tools. Abel lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't relax. He looked back at Nita. Stay in the spare room, now. She moved quickly, still clutching the satchel. JC Harkin followed her with worried eyes. Abel opened the door just enough to speak through. Morning, Jed. Jed Flint stood dripping rainwater from his hat brim. Storm knocked out my east fence. Got any spare wire? Maybe. Let me check. Jed peered past him, not suspicious, just nosy. Anyone else here? Abel's voice stayed firm. Just me and JC. Jed nodded, not sensing the tension. Town boys rode through earlier, he said, wiping rain from his chin. Said they're tracking some Apache widow. Sheriff's stirring trouble about it. Abel's pulse tightened. What did they say? Claimed she killed her husband. But you know how Clyde Barker gets when he wants a story to spread. Jed shrugged, spitting rain off his lip. I just hope they don't bring their mess up here. Abel kept his tone even. They won't find anything on my land. Jed laughed lightly. Always said you kept your place clean. He stepped back. Let me know if you find that wire. I will. Abel closed the door and exhaled slowly. Nita stepped back into the room, eyes wide with fear and apology. I caused danger, she whispered. You lie for me again. I told the truth, Abel said. For now. JC took Nita's hand again, small, gentle, certain. You're safe here, the little girl said. Nita's breath broke, her voice barely holding. I not know how to repay. Abel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting between worry and a quiet protectiveness. You don't owe me anything yet, he said softly. But you do need to stay alive. A silence settled in, heavy and full of things none of them were ready to say out loud. Outside, the rain continued in steady drops. Inside, danger had drawn a tighter circle around the ranch. But so had the invisible threads binding the three of them together. And Abel understood something clearly now. This wasn't just shelter. This was the beginning of a fight he hadn't asked for, but one he wouldn't walk away from. By the time evening settled, the storm had thinned into a cold drizzle. The land around the cabin lay quiet except for the occasional groan of wet timber and the slow drip from the eaves. Abel lit the oil lamps one by one, their warm glow pushing back the dark corners of the room. JC helped stack leftover firewood near the hearth, her small hands working with careful purpose. Nita sat nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her satchel resting on her lap as if she feared losing sight of it even for a moment. Her color had improved, but her posture still carried tension, especially when the wind shifted or when distant sounds echoed across the plains. She watched Abel every few seconds, studying him, measuring him, trying to understand whether she had brought danger into the one place that had shown her kindness. Abel felt her eyes, but didn't comment. He checked the rifle again, making sure it was cleaned and loaded, then placed it within reach beside the front door. JC noticed the gesture, her expression tightening. Papa, she whispered, are the men coming back tonight? He paused before answering. Maybe not tonight, but they'll try again. Nita lowered her gaze at that, guilt pressing into her shoulders. I not want you fight my battle, she said softly. You have child. You have life. I bring only trouble. Abel looked at her directly. You didn't bring trouble. Trouble was already out there. You just showed up before it found someone else. That answer filled a gap any listener might ask. Why was Abel choosing to stand with her? Because he didn't see her as the cause, only as someone caught in the path. JC climbed onto the bench beside Nita. Are you feeling better now? She asked gently. Yes, Nita whispered. Stronger. In your legs? Nita hesitated. Still weak, but better than before. Abel listened carefully. If they needed to run, which he hoped they wouldn't, he had to know her limits. Let me look at your feet, he said. Nita stiffened instinctively. They fine, she replied too quickly. JC frowned. If they hurt, Papa can fix them. Nita looked from the girl to Abel, then slowly nodded. She set her satchel aside, close enough to grab, and lifted her feet toward him. Her ankles and soles were swollen, bruised from days of walking on hard ground. Cuts ran along the edges. Blisters had burst and dried. Abel knelt and examined them carefully. You've been walking too long on torn skin, he said. No wonder your legs gave out. Pain is small, she murmured. Pain matters, he said. "If they get infected, you won't stand at all." He cleaned the wounds with warm water and a soft cloth. Nita's breath hitched each time he pressed against a tender spot. But she didn't pull away. The closeness made the air shift. His hands firm and steady, her breathing shallow, her eyes lingering on his jaw the way someone looks at a man they're beginning to trust more than they should. JC watched silently, sensing the weight of the moment without understanding its shape. When Abel finished, he wrapped her feet with clean bandages. "You'll walk better tomorrow," he said, "but don't push it." Nita nodded, her voice quiet. "Thank you." A long silence settled as she pulled the blanket closer, trying to hide the exposed tear of her dress. She adjusted it again, cheeks warming, but Abel looked away respectfully, pretending not to notice. That quiet respect deepened her trust in a way words couldn't. After a while, she spoke again. "If they find me here—" Nita paused, searching for words. "Will Sheriff punish you?" Abel Harkin leaned back in his chair. "Sheriff can try," he said evenly, "but the law doesn't reach well out here, and I don't answer to rumors." Listeners might wonder if Clyde Barker's authority could truly touch him, or whether Abel risked legal consequences by protecting her. But out here, frontier law was loose, and Abel Harkin wasn't a man easily intimidated. "Besides," he added, "you've got proof your husband gave you that land. That matters." Nita's fingers tightened around the blanket. "They say I steal paper. They say I lie." "They'll have to say it to me," Abel replied. Her breath trembled, relief mixing with fear, and something softer she hadn't felt in a long time. JC Harkin rested her head against Nita's arm. "You're staying, right?" Nita's throat tightened. I stay until danger passes." Abel didn't correct her, though he knew danger never really passed out here. It only waited for another turn. Instead, he stood, walked to the window, and looked out. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the land quiet in a way that felt intentional. The kind of quiet that made a man listen harder. He spoke without turning. "Tomorrow, I'll ride into town." Both Nita and JC froze. "What?" Nita whispered sharply. "I need to know what story they're spreading," he said. "If Sheriff Barker is in deeper than they admit, we need to be ready." Nita's voice tightened. "If they see you talk to them, they think you help me." "I don't care what they think," he replied. "But I need to know what they plan." "And me?" she asked faintly. "You stay here. Rest, watch JC. Keep the door barred if I'm gone too long." JC's eyes grew wide. "Papa, will they hurt you?" "No," he said firmly. "They know better." But Nita wasn't convinced. Her voice trembled. "You risk much for woman you not know." Abel finally turned to face her. "I know enough." The air between them held something unspoken. Fear, gratitude, and a spark of something stronger growing with each hour. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'll be back before sundown." Nita rose slightly from her seat despite the pain in her legs. "Abel, if they accuse you—" "They won't," he said. "And if they try, they'll regret it." She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the weight he carried for her. Listeners might wonder, does Nita want to run? Will she leave once he's gone? Chapter 6 answered that. She wasn't planning to leave. Her fear now wasn't of capture. It was of losing the first safe place she'd found. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "I wait for you." He held her gaze for several seconds. "Good." Night settled thick and still. Inside the cabin, the three of them sat close to the fire. No longer strangers, but not quite a family yet. The distance between those two things was shrinking fast. Abel Harkin left before first light. The leather creaked beneath him as he swung onto his bay horse and took the cattle road east, his coat pulled tight and his rifle slung. The ground was slick from last night's drizzle, so he kept the pace steady. He needed answers more than speed. At the cabin door, Nita had stood with JC behind her and said very little. "Only come back," she'd whispered. And he'd said, "I will." Then he rode out and didn't look back, because looking back made leaving harder than it needed to be. The town woke slow, smoke curling from cook stoves, 2 freight wagons parked in front of the mercantile, and the jailhouse lamps still burning in the window. Inside sat Sheriff Clyde Barker, a heavy man with careful eyes, and 2 deputies, one of them the blonde, mustached rider from yesterday, Boone Taggart. They looked surprised to see Abel Harkin walk in with hat in hand and no apology in his eyes. "Morning," Abel said evenly. "I heard you've got men chasing a widow on a murder claim. I want to know if there's a warrant or just talk." Barker leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "There's a statement from the dead man's brother and a notice of detention signed by me," he said, tapping a paper. "No circuit judge stamped it yet, but I don't need one to hold a suspect." "Where's your proof?" Abel asked. "The brother swore he saw her push her husband toward a blade during a drunken quarrel," Barker said. "He says she ran after, which is what guilty folks do." "Or what scared folks do when the crowd turns," Abel countered. "Does the brother inherit the land if she hangs?" The room shifted. Boone Taggart's mouth tightened. Barker didn't answer fast enough. "That land interest's in your file," Abel said calmly. "And you're ignoring it because the brother paid for riders. I want to see the paper he filed." Barker slid the notice across the desk. Abel scanned the lines. Accusations with no witness but the brother. No mention of the widow's deed. No tribal marks. No healer's statement. "You left out half the story," Abel said. "There's a deed naming the widow as heir. I've seen it. You take her without a judge, you're stealing for him." Boone snorted. "You offering yourself as counsel now, Harkin?" "I'm offering you a way to keep this from turning bad," Abel said, eyes fixed on the sheriff. "You want her? Get a circuit judge. You want the papers? File proper. You send bounty riders on my land again without a writ, and you'll meet me at my fence." Barker studied him, weighing trouble against effort. "We'll ride out tomorrow with 3 men and look again," he said finally. "If she's there, we take her." "Bring a writ," Abel said flatly. He turned and left before anyone could speak again. Outside, Jed Flint caught his arm. "Word is the brother offered $50 cash to anyone who brings her to the South Ford by sundown tomorrow," Jed whispered. "Boys from the freight train are talking about trying for it. You better get home?" Abel nodded once, mounted, and pushed the bay harder on the return. The wind cut his eyes. The ridge lifted slow. The cabin came into view with smoke curling up through the still air. No riders in sight. When he stepped inside, Nita was at the table mending the seam of her dress, with JC holding the thread spool. Both looked up at once, fear and relief mingling in one long breath. "What did they say?" Nita asked. "They come tomorrow," Abel Harkin said, setting his hat down. 3 men at least, maybe more from town. No proper writ, just muscle." He crossed the hearth and pulled up the loose floorboard he had pried open at dawn. "Give me the papers," he said. When Nita handed him the satchel, he wrapped the deed in oiled cloth and slid it beneath the plank. "No one touches this unless I'm dead. If they search, they won't find it." JC Harkin's eyes were wide. "Will they try to take her?" "They'll try," Abel said. "They don't get to." He set the next steps clear, because men like him didn't survive on hope, only on plans. "At first light, I'll move the horses to the brush draw and cut a spare line to the back gate. Jed Flint will bring a wagon and wait on the road with a broken wheel to stall them. If riders push through, I'll meet them at the porch with the rifle. If they cross the fence, we fall back to the cabin and bar the door. You take JC to the spare room and stay down. Understand?" Nita swallowed hard, then nodded. "I understand." He showed her how to drop the bar, how to reload the spare pistol, how to move JC behind the bed if glass broke. He checked the windows, set tools beside the door, stacked spare hides to block a line of sight from the yard. Every motion practical, every detail rehearsed. Nothing showy, only what kept people alive in lonely places. When the work eased, JC crawled onto the bench again. "Papa," she whispered, "are we a family?" Abel looked at her, then at Nita, who stood very still with a mended seam between her fingers. "We're a house that stands together," he said quietly. "That's what matters." Evening drew across the land, quiet, cold, and still. Nita helped JC wash and settle for bed. Then she stepped to Abel at the door, her voice low. "You spoke for me in town," she said. "You risked your name and your place." "I told the truth," he replied. She reached up without thinking and touched his jaw with the backs of her fingers, a small, careful gesture that said more than words. Her eyes steady, her breath unsteady. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he leaned in, and they kissed once in the dim lamplight, not rushed, not hungry, simply sure. Her hand at his shirt, his palm resting at her waist. They broke apart because they had to breathe, because JC slept in the next room and morning would bring riders. "I stay," she whispered, the words firm for the first time since she arrived. "Good," he said. Then Abel barred the door and sat in the chair facing it, the rifle across his knees. Nita lay down beside JC, one hand resting over the child's blanket. The lamps dimmed. The house went quiet except for the crackle of fire, and the plan burned into all their minds. The missing pieces were now clear. What the law planned, why the papers mattered, how the defense would hold, and where each of them would stand when the hooves finally came. Dawn arrived, colorless and cold. The kind of morning that held sound still in the air. Frost clung to the fence rails, and the horse's breath rose in slow white clouds. Abel Harkin hadn't slept. He had spent the night in that same chair, rifle across his knees, listening for hooves that never came. When the first light touched the window, he stood quietly and stretched the stiffness from his back. In the spare room, Nita was already awake, sitting upright beside JC, who slept curled against her. She hadn't slept much either. Her eyes were sharp but tired, her fingers resting protectively on the girl's blanket. When she saw Abel in the doorway, she spoke softly. "Today they come." "Maybe," he said. "But we're ready." She nodded, though fear still pressed in her breath. There was something else in her expression, too, something that made listeners wonder. Was she thinking of running to spare them? Was she planning to surrender to save the ranch? Chapter 8 answered that before doubt could take root. "You said I stay," she whispered. "So I stay. I not run." Abel stepped closer. "Running's what they expect," Abel Harkin said. "Staying's what they won't know how to handle." JC Harkin stirred, rubbing her eyes, unaware of the weight hanging in the room. "Papa, are we doing the plan now?" "Some of it," he said. "First we move the horses so no one gets spooked." He saddled the bay and led the other two animals toward the brush draw behind the ridge. Nita watched from the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her torn deerskin dress fluttering in the cold. The rip still exposed part of her chest where the beadwork had come apart. But she held the blanket carefully, modest and composed despite the damage. Her legs shook slightly, still sore from days of running, but she stood her ground. She wasn't helpless, just recovering. JC stood beside her, holding tight to her hand. "You scare?" the little girl asked. Nita swallowed. "Yes," she whispered, "but not as before." "Because Papa's here?" "Yes," Nita said softly. "Because he's staying, with me, inside the cabin." When Abel returned, he checked the rifle once more, then walked Nita through the steps again. How to bar the door, how to bolt the back latch, how to move JC behind the bed if riders broke the glass. She repeated each instruction slowly, carefully, making sure she understood. The hesitation that once held her back was gone now. Fear remained, but it no longer ruled her. She wanted to protect this place as much as he did. By mid-morning, the land had fallen silent, an eerie, heavy kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. Abel stood at the porch rail, eyes on the southern ridge. The cold wind carried nothing at first. No sound, no movement. Then, around noon, the stillness cracked. Distant hoofbeats rolled across the plains. Nita stiffened beside the window. JC grabbed her hand again. Abel stepped off the porch, rifle low but ready. 3 riders crested the ridge, just as Jed Flint had warned. 2 deputies and 1 other man, unfamiliar but armed. They didn't ride fast. They rode with confidence. That was worse. The blonde, mustached deputy raised a hand. "Harkin," he called. "Sheriff wants the widow brought in. No need for trouble." "Where's your writ?" Abel asked. The men traded looks. They had none, not even a forged one. The broad deputy with the crooked nose scowled. "We don't need a judge to take a killer." Abel stepped forward, his voice calm but cold. "You're crossing private land without authority." The unfamiliar rider, tall and long-coated with a hard jaw, leaned in his saddle. "We're here for the Apache widow. We heard she came this way. You give her up, we leave quiet." Abel's jaw set. "No one here fits your story." "That's so?" the man said. "That's so." Inside the cabin, Nita pressed a hand over her mouth. Her breath came quick and shallow, but she didn't run. She stayed where Abel told her to stay. The tall rider swung down first. "Search the place," he ordered. Abel raised his rifle, slow, steady, clear in meaning. "Your next step decides whether this ends with words or bullets." The blonde deputy hesitated. "Harkin, we don't want trouble." "You brought it," Abel said flatly. "We're doing our job." "No," he replied. "You're doing a dirty errand for a man chasing land that isn't his." They didn't deny it, and that silence told him everything. The tall rider's eyes narrowed. "If we go back empty, sheriff sends us again. You want that?" "You won't get through me," Abel said. A long silence stretched across the yard, heavy enough to crush the wind itself. Inside, JC clung tighter to Nita. "Papa's strong," she whispered. Nita squeezed her hand gently. "He is." The tall rider studied Abel a moment longer, then spat in the dirt. "Not worth dying over," he muttered. "Let the sheriff clean his own mess." The blonde deputy gave Abel a last, resentful look, but followed. Dusty Maris, the one with the crooked nose, lingered at the edge of the yard. "You made your choice, Harkin." "I did," Abel said. The 3 riders turned and rode slow over the ridge. Only when their silhouettes vanished did Abel lower the rifle. Inside, Nita exhaled the breath she'd been holding for too long. She stepped onto the porch despite her trembling legs, stopping beside him. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something deeper. You risked more than land, she whispered. You risked everything. Abel looked at her, his voice low. Some things are worth standing for. Her breath shook. I not know how to thank. You're safe, he said. That's enough. She stepped closer, instinctive, natural, until her hand rested on his chest, her fingers trembling against the coarse fabric of his shirt. The closeness wasn't forced, wasn't rushed, but it carried a quiet weight neither of them had been ready to feel days ago. Inside, JC peeked from the doorway, watching them with the unshaken certainty only a child could have. And for the first time since Nita had come to the ranch, the fear surrounding them eased, just a little, leaving space for something else to grow. The riders were gone, but peace didn't settle easily. Abel stayed on the porch long after their shapes disappeared across the ridge, the cold wind tugging at his coat and brushing the rifle barrel as he kept watch, listening for any echo of returning hooves. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. He waited. Inside, Nita stood behind the doorway, blanket tight around her shoulders, satchel clutched against her ribs. Her legs still shook, but she didn't go back to her seat. She didn't want him standing there alone. JC peeked past her hip. Papa, they're really gone? They are, Abel said, lowering the rifle. But Sheriff won't try again, not after today. Listeners might ask why. Why a ruthless lawman would suddenly back down. The truth was simple. The men he sent only had power if Abel Harkin allowed it. Out here, miles from the courthouse, without a judge's writ, they had nothing. And hired riders don't die for another man's lies. When Abel stepped back inside, the warmth seemed to follow him. The fire crackled, the air softened, and the tension that had held the cabin for days began to ease. You stood against them, Nita whispered. You alone. I wasn't alone, he said, glancing at JC, then at her. Not anymore. Nita's breath caught. She lowered her eyes, the truth hitting deep. She had been cast out by her people, hunted by strangers, stripped of safety and dignity. And now, someone stood with her. Not for payment, not for pride, simply because she mattered. JC ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his leg. You protected us, she said proudly. Abel softened, kneeling down and pressing a kiss to her forehead. I protect what's mine. Nita's eyes lifted slowly. What? She asked quietly. What is yours? Abel Harkin looked at her in a way that made the rest of the room fade. This home, this land, my daughter. He paused, letting the silence do its work. And whoever lives under this roof by choice. The meaning struck Nita like warmth breaking through frost. You mean me, she whispered. If you want to stay, he said simply. Listeners might wonder, could she stay? Would she always be hunted? Would the accusation follow her forever? Chapter 9. Closed those questions once and for all. Abel crossed to the hearth and pulled up the loose floorboard. From beneath, he drew out the oiled cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully. Then he placed the land deed in her hands. This is proof of your innocence, he said. Your husband gave you that land. His brother lied. And Clyde Barker, he lied to protect him. Those men today saw I wasn't backing down. They won't risk coming again for something they can't claim. Nita pressed the deed to her chest, tears filling her eyes, but refusing to fall. So, it is over. Abel nodded. Sheriff won't cross the line again. His deputies know this place is watched. Your name is safe here. She sank into the nearest chair, the relief so strong it shook her breath. Months of running, hiding, starving, being hunted like an animal, finally ended. J.C. Harkin climbed into her lap as if she had always belonged there. "You can stay with us," the little girl said. "Forever, if you want." Nita's hands trembled as she placed them around the child. "I want," she whispered. "I want very much." Abel approached, slow and steady. Nita lifted her gaze to meet his. He reached down, brushing his thumb along her cheek, wiping away the single tear that finally escaped. "You're safe now," he said softly. "No one will take you from here." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, her fingers clutching his shirt. Not from weakness, but from something new, something solid. He wrapped one arm around her, the other resting gently across her back, holding her the way a man holds something he's afraid to lose. J.C. rested her head against both of them, sighing in pure contentment. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of fire. No fear in the corners, no dread in the walls. Only warmth, only breath. 3 souls who had been alone too long. Finally, home. Nita lifted her face, her voice barely above a whisper. "Abel, I not know how to be part of a home now." He touched her jaw gently. "You already are." Then he kissed her. Slow, steady, certain. A kiss full of everything they had endured, everything they hoped for, everything that made staying stronger than running. She kissed him back with that same quiet certainty, her fingers curling into his shirt, her breath trembling against his neck when they finally pulled apart. J.C. giggled softly from her chair. "You love her, Papa?" Abel didn't deny it. "I do." Nita's eyes softened with warmth he had never seen before. "And I love you." The words came without fear. Abel rested his forehead against hers. "Then stay," he whispered. "Stay with me. Stay with J.C. Stay in this home." "I will," she said, voice firm. "I stay." And that was the end of running. The chapter closed with no shadows left behind, no threat returning, no land uncertain, no doubt of belonging. Nita was no longer a fugitive. She was home. And the 3 of them, Abel, Nita, and J.C., stood at the doorway of a new life built not from fear, but from choice, trust, and love. A true family. Forever.